The Rebbe starts off the Sicha by bringing the pasuk Ves Aaron Ves Bonav Tifkoid, that you will appoint Aaron and his children, V'shamres Kuhunasam, they will guard their Kuhuna, V'azora Korev Yumos, and any foreigner that gets close, Yumos will die, will be put to death. Rashi brings the words V'shamres Kuhunasam, he explains the words, what does it mean they will guard their Kuhuna? Rashi explains this as meaning Kabbalas Domim, receiving the blood, Uzrika, sprinkling the blood, V'aktara is burning the various different parts that need to be burnt on the Mizbeach. And then Rashi says, Va'avoidos ha'mesuros l'koyanim, and the avoidos that are given over to the koyanim. That means that Rashi is explaining the word kuhunasam, they need to guard the kuhunasam referring to the avoidos, to the service of the koyanim. So v'shamru as kuhunasam would then mean that they should guard it in the sense not to allow a foreigner to do one of these avoidos. As the pasuk says, as quoted before, Va'azora korev, any foreigner that gets close, Yumos will be put to death. The Even Ezra, on the other hand, explains v'shamru es kuhunasam, that koyanim need to be guarding their own kuhuna, they need to guard themselves, their kuhuna, that they shouldn't become pasul for kuhuna, for example, through becoming tamei, etc. So the question is, where is Rashi getting this from to translate the word kuhunasam, guarding their kuhuna, not in the literal sense, as the Even Ezra explains, to guard the kuhuna itself, meaning to make sure they remain proper koyanim and not becoming pasul. Instead, Rashi is explaining they should guard the avoidos that are given over to the koyanim to make sure that nobody else does this avodah. We cannot say, says the Rebbe, that what's forcing Rashi to say this is the ending of the pasuk, those words v'hazora korev yumas, that any foreigner that gets close will be put to death, which is clearly speaking about a foreigner that does the avodah of the kohen, which might tell us at the beginning of the pasuk also must be speaking about the avodas of the kohenim, and this is what you need to guard, the avodah of the kohenim. Because if that would be forcing Rashi to say this, Rashi in his Dibur HaMaschil should have quoted these words of the end of the pasuk as well, Va'azora korev yumas, or at the very least, hint to them through the word v'goymer. What is actually the reason why those words Va'azora korev yumas do not force us to say that the beginning of the pasuk is also speaking about the same idea, making sure that no one else does the avodah? Because it's possible to say that Va'azora korev yumas is not a continuation to V'shamru es kuhunasam. It is possible to say that there's two things the pasuk is telling us. Guard your kuhuna, as the Even Ezra would have learned. And possibly the next thing is another point. Va'azora korev, make sure that nobody gets close. So we still need to understand where is Rashi getting from that it is actually one and the same thing, and kuhunasam means you should guard the avodos of the kuhuna. We also need to understand why is it that Rashi brings in his Dibur HaMaschil the words v'shamru es. Why doesn't he just bring the word that he's explaining, kuhunasam? Rashi's explaining it means their avodah. Learning this Pirush and Rashi, at first glance what seems to be, is that when Rashi says the examples, Kabbalas Domim, receiving the blood, sprinkling, Haktara, burning the fats on the Mizbeach, these are examples, seemingly, of what Rashi says further. He says, and the avoidos that are given to the Koyanim. But the Rebbe says we can't actually say that. Because if we would say that, we have a couple of problems. Number one, the arichus of the wording in Rashi. Why does Rashi even need any examples? Rashi could just say briefly, the avoidos that are given over to the koyanim. We know which kind of avoidos are the koyanim's avodah. Number two, if we want to negate the avoidos that are before receiving the blood, because those avoidos, as we know, could be done by a non-kohen, for example, shechting. So all Rashi needed to say was mikabala va'elech, starting from the receiving of the blood onwards, which are the avoidos hamesuros l'koyanim. Rashi could have concluded with those words. These are the avoidos that are given to the koyanim, and that's what you need to guard. Another point, says the Rebbe, if Rashi does need to give examples, why does he give 3 examples? Another thing the Rebbe is bothered by is the order in Rashi. First, Rashi gives us examples, and then he says, va'avoidos hamesuros l'koyanim, and the avoidos that are given over to the koyanim. Seemingly, it should have been the other way around. First, you say avoidis hamasuras l'koyanim, the avoidis that the koyanim do, which is the general idea, and then you start giving examples, and you would say kegoin, for example, kabbalas damim, receiving the blood, and so on. A final point that Rebbe says, and a main point, since these things, Kabbalah, receiving the blood, sprinkling the blood, and burning the different parts on the Mizbeach, are, as we said, avoidis mesuras l'koyanim, are avoidis that are given over to the koyanim. So what should have Rashi said? Rather than saying ve'avoidis ha'mesuras l'koyanim, which makes it sound like it's something else, the Rashi should have said usha'ar, and the rest of the avoidis that are given over to the koyanim. From all of this, says the Rebbe, it's understood that Rashi is actually telling us that there's two things. V'shamru es kuhunasam is including two categories. There is the first three things that the Rashi says, Kabbalas domim, zrika, and aktorah. These are avodos, which are not part of the next group of mesuros l'koyanim, as the Rebbe is going to explain later in the Sicha. And then there's another group of avodos that are given over to the koyanim. So we need to understand, says the Rebbe, it seems surprising. Rashi himself told us already in the beginning of Parshas Vayikra that from Kabbalah onwards, from the receiving of the blood, is clearly the mitzvah's kuhuna, it's the mitzvah for the koyanim. So how can we now seemingly differentiate and say that there's Kabbalah's domim, zrika, and aktorah as a separate entity, not part of the avodos that are given over to the koyanim? The second point that Rebbe asks is if we should even find some sort of explanation why Kabbalah's domim, receiving the blood, and these other avodos that Rashi mentions individually are not avodos hamasuras l'koyanim, are not part of the avodah that's given over to a kohen. If that's the case, then we need to understand where is Rashi taking a proof, where is Rashi getting it from, that when it says v'shamru es kuhunasam, which is clearly speaking about the avodah of koyanim, so then where's Rashi getting that it would also include these other avodos that are not mesuros l'koyanim, that are not given over to the koyanim? To explain all of this, says the Rebbe, what's getting Rashi to say that v'shamru es kuhunasam does not mean guarding the actual kahuna, like the Even Ezra explains. Rather, it means the avodos that are given over to the koyanim is from the words of the pasuk itself. The pasuk is clearly coming to give over a new task, a new appointment for Aaron and his children. As Rashi says on the word tifkoid, Rashi explains it's lashon pkidus, it's a lashon of an appointment. It's a lashon of a new job being given. If v'shamru es kuhunasam in our pasuk would mean that koyanim need to guard themselves not to become puzzle, in their kahuna shouldn't become messed up through tumah and other sorts of psulim, so then this isn't a new job, this isn't a new appointment. This is something that they were clearly commanded already earlier in Parshas Amoir of how a kohen needs to watch himself. This is what's causing Rashi to learn that this new appointment, this new job consists of the fact that they need to watch that a zor, that a foreigner should not come and do these avodos that were given over for koyanim. In other words, that v'shamru in the beginning of the pasuk, that they need to watch their kahuna is connected to the v'hazora karev yumos. It is part of that same appointment. Now we'll also understand why Rashi is quoting the words v'shamru es kahunasam, those first two words, which is clearly indicating that there's a command for a new appointment, that they're going to be guarding something, they're going to be watching, this is their new job, because the way how Rashi knows that we're speaking about the kahuna is referring to guarding their avodah is because, as we just said, they're being commanded now and appointed for a new job, as opposed to just saying they should watch their kahuna in the sense of not becoming apostle. That wouldn't have been a new job. Now Rashi, says the Rebbe, is mainly coming over here to deal with another problem, another question that you could ask in the pasuk. Both in the previous psukim and in the further psukim, in other words, all the psukim around this particular pasuk, are actually speaking about the Leviim, the avodah of the Leviim, the count of the Leviim, and so on. So the question is, how is it that suddenly, in middle of all of this, we suddenly have the appointment of Aaron and his children, who are the kohanim, with v'shamru es kuhunasam, they should guard their kahuna. Seemingly, this appointment for this job that they need to do should have been earlier in the Torah, where the Torah is giving over about the Koyanim, Eile Shmois B'nei Aaron HaKoyanim, they were anointed to do their jobs for Kahuna, or in other places. How does it fit in right over here in middle of speaking about the Leviim? This is what's bothering Rashi. And from this we understand that from what we have learned earlier about the Avodah of the Leviim, when we look what the Torah says about the Leviim, it actually may have caused us to think that someone that's not a Kohen should be allowed to do certain avodas in the Mishkan and the Mikdash. And this is why Torah, while it's speaking about the Leviim and describing what Leviim do, needs to immediately warn us and say, no, only Aaron and his children are going to do this, and they need to be warned to make sure nobody else does this. Va'azor HaKorev, and any foreigner that gets close, you must. What is this all about? Says the Rebbe, the explanation is as follows. The Pasuk earlier said, in these psukim, that the Leviim need to guard Mishmeres B'nei Yisrael. What does it mean, Mishmeres B'nei Yisrael? So Rashi explains that really all of the Yidden needed to be involved in the things in the Beis HaMikdash, doing the various different jobs in the Beis HaMikdash, but the Leviim are coming instead of them, b'shlichusam, on their behalf. They're agents of the Yidden. That is the meaning, Mishmeres B'nei Yisrael, that the Leviim are really working on behalf of B'nei Yisrael. Since the Leviim are shluchim of the Yidden for the needs of the Mikdash, so perhaps we could have said that those avodos, which we do find in some areas of Torah, that even Yisraelim were able to do and did do, as we'll soon discuss. So such avodos, perhaps we might say, the Leviim should be allowed to do, maybe even they have to do. In other words, after the Hakamas HaMishkan, these are the things that even Leviim do instead of and on behalf of the Yisraelim. And this is what Rashi means when he says V'shamru es kuhunasam. He brings three specific things. These are not examples of what says later about the things that are given over to the Koyanim. Rashi says Kabbalas Domim, Zrika, and Aktorah. It is specifically regarding these three avodas that we find that all Yidden, meaning Yisraelim, have done them already before. Again, as we'll see a little bit later in the Sicha. And therefore we could have thought that now the Leviim could do them instead of the Yisraelim. And that's why when we're speaking about the job of the Leviim, speaking about the fact that the Leviim work on behalf of the Yisraelim, we must immediately warn V'shamru es kuhunasam, that the Koyanim need to make sure that the Leviim are not stepping out of place and doing the avodah that a Kohen specifically needs to do, Va'azor HaKorev Yumos. Now, Rashi doesn't stop there. He doesn't suffice only with those three things. He does add the second category, Va'avodos HaMesuros LaKoyanim. So too, all the avodos that are given to the Koyanim, meaning avodos that are specifically, right from the outset, given to Koyanim, avodos when we never even thought that anybody else could do them. Not a Levi, not a foreigner that is able to do them. Why does Rashi need to add that? Says the Rebbe, since this is the place where we're speaking about the V'shamru es kuhunasam, what the Kohen need to guard in regards to the first three things, which is Kabbalas Domim, Zrika, and Aktorah, where we could have thought that maybe a Levi should be allowed to do it. So therefore, since we're warning about that, we understand that when it says V'shamru es kuhunasam, this is also going to include all the avodos, even the avodos that are directly given to Koyanim. So they certainly have to be guarded that nobody else should do them other than Koyanim. So now the Rebbe comes back to what we were discussing. Where do we find that the Bnei Yisrael have actually done those three avodos? And that's why we may have thought that now too, the Leviim could technically do these avodos for the Bnei Yisrael. That means it belongs to the Bnei Yisrael, and the Leviim could possibly do them on their behalf, and that's why we need to be warned. No, only Koyanim are going to do it. Says the Rebbe, we have this in Pshutei Shel Mikra. It's simple psukim in Chumash. In Parshas Boy, we have the Korban Pesach that was brought in Mitzrayim. The Yidden are told. Moshe is told about the Yidden. V'lakchu min adam, they're going to take from the blood and put it on the two doorposts. V'achlu es habasar, they'll eat the meat, sliyesh, roasted in fire, al krov, al kirboy, the whole animal altogether, etc. What do we see from here? There's three things that the Yidden themselves needed to do. V'lakchu min adam, they're taking the blood, which as Rashi explains, this is the concept of Kabbalah, of receiving the blood, like was done later in the Beis HaMikdash. V'nosnu. Then we have the second part, where this one is similar to the fact that they're going to take the blood and put it on the doorposts, etc. This is going to be similar to the concept of zrika, of sprinkling the blood on the mizbeach. And finally, we have roasting on the fire, which is like the idea of the haktorah, the things that are burnt on the mizbeach. Says the Rebbe, this is why one could have thought that when future generations will remark the Korban Pesach, which in many ways is similar to the Pesach Mitzrayim, we learn many halachos regarding the Pesach Doides from Pesach Mitzrayim, as Rashi himself brings in Parshas Boy. So we could have said that these kind of avodos do belong and have a connection to the Yidden themselves, that means even the Yisraelim, and therefore Leviim could do them and should do them, b'shlichusam, on their behalf, like we were just discussing in these psukim, that's what Leviim are all about, doing avodos on behalf of the Yidden. That's why immediately the pasuk has to say, "V'shamru es kuhnasam." The kohanim, to make sure to guard those avodos of kabbalas damim and zrika and aktorah, as said before. Now the Rebbe says you cannot ask, how is it even possible to think that these avodos should be able to be done through the Leviim, if we already said that Rashi says mi kabbalah va'elech, that from receiving the blood onwards clearly belongs to the kohanim. Says the Rebbe, because that pasuk, where we learn out this idea that receiving the blood, it belongs to the kohanim, that's said by a korban oila. And similarly by other karbonis that say in the beginning of Parshas Vayikra. However, we don't find in the pasuk that the avodos, for example, of the Pesach doiros, and so too the avodah of a korban which is meiser behema. We don't find that those things need to be done through kohanim, so therefore we could have still thought that certain karbonos, Leviim could do them, and that's why the pasuk has to say the kohanim have to make sure that that doesn't happen. The Rebbe concludes with Ohiro in Avodas Hashem. If there is this sort of difference between different categories within Yidden themselves, which generally all Yidden are vatam tili mamlechas kohanim, so holy and so great and so on, and we say that even avodos that generally are Yisrael is shaykh to, it is part of their needs, and nevertheless we say there's no way that they themselves or the Leviim could go and do it for them. V'azor hakariv yumas, it only belongs to the kohen. And furthermore, not only isn't it going to add kedusha to the one who tries to do it if it's not his avodah, but just the opposite is going to bring to the lack of his existence, meaning it's going to negate his existence. As we said, that a foreigner that gets close, yumas, will be put to death. How much more so when we speak about the separation between Yisrael or Amim, between Yidden and Goyim. That, chas v'shalom, if we want to try to mix in through a concept of giur, conversion, which is not according to halacha, we're taking someone that's truly a foreigner, and someone that's from amongst the nations, and we want to mix him into Am Yisrael with a calculation and saying, yes, possibly it's going to cause some damage or big sakana for the Yidden, but at least we're doing this person, this non-Jew, a favor. So the Rebbe says the truth is it's not like that. It's not even a favor for him. There's tremendous damage being done. It's a matter that becomes a big stumbling block for everyone, and in fact, even the opposite again of his true life and existence. It's only when we don't touch that which Hashem, the Noisin HaTorah, had created, which is that separation ben Yisrael Amim. It's the only way that we can get to true shalom and good in the world for every single person in the whole world.